Welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today, I am sharing a conversation with Kyle Mamounis, PhD, from 3 years ago about the consequences of low carb and restricting your dietary carbs. And this was recorded before we started a podcast, but the message still applies today. So the common message and belief in the low carb space is that we do not need to consume dietary carbs. They're non-essential. And instead, our body can produce all the carbs it needs through processes like gluconeogenesis. Yes, this is true. Your body can make carbs, but are there consequences to relying on this pathway? And is this truly optimal? Or is it better to just give the body the carbs that it needs? So today, Kyle and I discuss these questions, and we discuss the consequences of not consuming sufficient dietary carbs. Sarah and I were on a low carb carnivore diet for around a year in the 2018 to 2019 era. And it felt great at first until our metabolic health and our thyroid health started to suffer. If you are doing well and you feel great on a low carb diet, keep going. That's amazing. You do what makes you feel best. But perhaps this conversation can be helpful for those who, maybe still trying a low carb diet or can't really get it right. They're starting to see negative symptoms pop up despite someone on the internet telling them, no, you have to do this. This is the optimal way of living. So we cover many of the points that Kyle outlines in his research article titled, quote, "The Dangers of Fat Metabolism and PUFA, Why You Don't Want to Be a Fat Burner." So that's the title, and it was published in the Journal of Evolution and Health in 2017. And a few of these points include lower carbon dioxide levels, lower thyroid hormone levels, inhibition of glucose metabolism, and more when you are in a low carb state and you are relying more on being a fat burner. So I hope you guys enjoy this conversation. All right. Hi, Kyle. Thank you so much for coming back on the Strong.Sistas channel. If you guys haven't already, make sure you tune into our conversation about PUFAs from a few weeks ago. So Kyle, can you briefly remind everyone kind of your education background and what you are currently up to in the nutrition and academia space?
Yeah. So I did a PhD at Rutgers, mostly about fatty acid metabolism or the effects of different types of fats on things like obesity and just metabolic syndrome type stuff. And I did that because I had been interested in diets ever since like 18 or 19. And I tried most of them. And by that, I mean like vegetarian, vegan, raw vegan, weird stuff like Agenus von der Planets, raw, primal, a handful of variations of paleo, including mostly carnivore and a mostly raw carnivore diet. And I got a bachelor's in biology and I wanted to do research. So eventually I did do that. And then coincidental with starting my PhD, I started reading Ray Peat's stuff and just added carbs back into my diet and kind of changed my perspective on those things. And then I think it was 2013, I went to one of the Ancestral Health Symposium meetings, which is mostly paleo and therefore mostly low carb, because that's just how that stuff goes. And I think I gave a talk that was lost. They weren't able to, the recordings got messed up somehow that year. But that one was kind of like about my dissertation, my actual graduate school dissertation proposal. And then in 2016 and 17, I went back again twice, once to give a talk about just like physiological dangers of pushing your system towards using fats primarily as fuel. And then the second one about sugar not causing insulin resistance. And that was kind of like the two things probably that are the most, viewed that I've ever done. And then I'm continuing to try to do things like that and also pursue a research career as well.
Cool. So in today's talk, we're kind of going to go over some of the points and extend a little bit beyond one of your papers that you published during grad school. Is that right?
Yeah. Is this the fat burner one?
Yes. So the dangers of fat metabolism and PUFA, why you don't want to be a fat burner. So it sounds like this was done during graduate school or after, but this was after you had kind of been introduced to Ray Peat's ideas, and so you probably had a lot of like the bioenergetic lens when you were in graduate school and going through the literature and examining different studies. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I think that would be a good place to start. I would say that Kyle has a really great perspective on the nutrition literature, which is kind of hard to weed through. So I think if we can start our conversation with kind of the issues with solely using clinical studies to assess whether or not low carb or keto is quote good or it's bad.
Mm. Okay. Well, each that's you kind of have to start with what type of clinical stuff you're talking about, because there's a lot of clinical like for example obesity literature that pretty well kind of puts puts to rest that, for example, like keto or low carb causes you to lose weight faster than mixed, more mixed diet with more carbohydrates, because in the metabolic ward situation where what you know individuals that are in these studies, when everything they're consuming is controlled, uh it doesn't really seem to matter. Like they'll lose just as much weight on a 2,500 calorie diet, whether it's 60% fat or 30% fat, at least for 2 weeks, 3 months, maybe would be a long one. So really with the clinical studies, the thing that I'm most critical of is that by nature, like they have to be short term.
Yeah.
And the higher the quality in terms of how many things are controlled, the more short term they have to be, because the more you're asking people to do, like there's some studies, some of the people that were my professors in graduate school or colleagues or whatever, they would take part in each other's stuff sometimes and do like really onerous things. Like one of my professors was consuming a super high protein diet for about 3 days, and he collected all of his urine and feces um to measure amino acid metabolites, like leaving in all ways. And that's really high quality data. However, um, you can't have somebody do that for a month, and you certainly can't have them do it for like 10 years,
Right.
which is much more relevant of a time scale for something that would be considered like on the, if we're talking about human health, like humans live for like 70 or 80 years, maybe if you're lucky, maybe longer if you're really lucky. So something like even a year or two. And also the way we store nutrients, like this has been shown. This is one of the first things that people, when I was into vegetarian and vegan stuff, like people start talking about B12, and it can take a decade depending on all kinds of factors, like how strict you are and what you're, probably some genetic things in your lifestyle and stuff like that, for really bad B12 deficiency symptoms to pop up. And then all of a sudden somebody could have serious heart problems and stuff. But, in a clinical study of 3 months, there would be no difference in somebody getting no dietary B12. So that's my biggest problem with using clinical studies as like the gold standard for every question, because they can't, they're just a tool like anything else, and they have limitations.
Yeah. It seems like in this day and age, you can find a study to support kind of whatever diet you want to go on. And maybe it's because of just the inherent limitations about human studies and how, like, we can't control every single variable for a very long period of time. And so what you bring up at the start of this paper is like you have, if you want to make some sense of the literature where there is conflicting data everywhere you look, you have to have some sort of like um, physiological view. So like having some sort of base understanding of how physiology works in order to make sense of all of the data.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I I haven't reread that paper for a while. So like I only very vaguely sort of know what exact statements you're talking about. But yeah, that sounds like something I would say.
Yeah. So basically, I think what we're going to try to start this conversation with is like kind of developing a brief overview and understanding of like how proper metabolism and how our system works, like the proper framing. So then we don't get lost in the nuances and we don't get lost in the bigger picture of like human physiology. So if we can start with just a brief overview of that. So I mean, what the audience is likely familiar with is there's like four macronutrients that we consume: carbs, fats, protein, and then some people consider alcohol a fourth one. And then for energy options in our body, we can turn carbs and fats into energy, and then ketones can also be used for energy. But protein is ultimately more of like a structural building block, but that can be converted into carbs through gluconeogenesis if necessary. So I think if we could talk a little bit on like the different requirements of all of those energy molecules in the body. So for example, like what part of the body needs glucose, what part of the body can run on fats and things like that.
Yeah. Well, just one addendum. Amino acids are actually converted into energy at a like reasonable amount. I think. Well, of course, if you're consuming very low carbohydrates, that amount will creep up and up. But even if you're consuming a relatively abundant amount of carbohydrates, I mean, at least a quarter of the dietary protein will go towards either glucose or like put into the citric acid cycle as a glucose equivalent, and maybe even more.
I didn't realize it was that much. I knew you can't fully avoid gluconeogenesis, but I didn't realize that it was still that much of your protein intake.
Yeah, well, the liver spits out maybe like 20. I forget exactly. Urea gets excreted. At I think it's like maybe like 20 grams of urea is produced a day.
Yeah.
And that that represents sort of like end. So that's ammonia being metabolized, and the lion's share, like almost, we could pretty much just say all of them ammonia. That's not necessarily true all, but like for practical purposes, all the ammonia that would be in that pool is from protein, from amino acids. And so if the ammonia is being lost, then that means the carbon skeleton, the alpha keto acid of that amino acid, went somewhere without ammonia anymore, which meant and there's always transamination happening. So some amino acids can go certain places, like alanine is sent around. For whatever reason, that's something that like the liver will send back to muscle, because the muscle can change certain amino acids into certain other ones, and the liver kind of has its own set of transaminations it can do. And so it has the Cori cycle where, like, when the muscle burns glucose, it sends lactate into the system, and the liver will usually make it into glucose again, and often through the amino acid alanine. But if that carbon skeleton of an amino acid is present, or like if you lose an ammonia, then that means you have a alpha keto acid that can't be an amino acid, whatever it is. And so that will be metabolized as a sort of like glucose equivalent, depending on which amino acid it is. Some of them are require a little bit more things to go into the citric acid cycle. But yeah, so essentially the ammonia loss in our system is roughly equivalent to the amount of amino acids that are like end product used, which means like generally, because if they're made into protein, they still have their ammonia.
Yeah.
So if they're taken and used as protein synthesis and they're sequestered in our lean tissues, then they're not losing their ammonia. So if they lose their ammonia, then they're probably being oxidized for energy.
Okay. Okay. So I guess
Uh,
that's a good thing to keep in mind. Like, I don't know, people always walk around being like, yeah, I'm fat fueled, or like, yeah, I'm carb fueled. But like in reality, like our body's kind of oxidizing all of them for fuel at some point. Like you can't be 100% one or the other. And even like you can't even avoid protein oxidation for energy sometimes. So I think that gets kind of lost in some people's minds. They just think that they're 100% one way, 100% the other way. However, I think we all know that your dietary composition, so what you're consuming in, will dictate the percentage of the oxidation of all of those macronutrients.
right. And really, like what you were saying before about what tissues use what, that is, thinking of it that way is one of the best ways to dispel the notion of like when somebody's like, oh, I'm going to be a fat burner, I'm going to get rid of this whole glucose thing because that's bad. Now that's a very, like, to be fair, most people that are a little bit more educated and are still low carb don't think of it quite that way. That's kind of like a low level, entry level perspective. But still, a lot of people probably imagine, oh, all my tissues are using fats, and that's good because there's like more energy in them and it doesn't interact with the insulin system, which is bad so much. But uh, there are tissues that just can't use anything other than glucose.
Yeah.
Um,
What are
so red blood cells,
okay?
because they don't have a nucleus, so they can no longer produce the enzymes necessary to do full oxidation of any energy substrate. So they just do glycolysis. I think they're the only denucleated tissue, at least the only significant one. I believe eyeballs and a couple of parts of some organs and glands spread throughout don't have a sufficient oxygen supply to do that much oxidative metabolism. So they're doing glycolysis as well.
Yeah.
And then the brain, of course, will either run on 100% glucose or pretty close to 100%, and that will oxidize it. But because fatty acids can't get past the blood-brain barrier. And then the whole thing with ketones, which is sort of like a level 2 low carb perspective to talk about, like, oh, well, it's not just fatty acids, it's ketones. And that's somebody that maybe is a little bit more educated that will talk about that. So even if you're in full-blown ketosis, ketogenic diet, like you're keeping up on it and how much of this and that you can eat to maintain your ketosis at a level that's considered being in ketosis and ketogenic state, I think you don't even get to 50% in the brain. It's still over 50% glucose, even if you're in full-on ketogenic state. So they can, I think, maybe like 45% ketones for a percent of energy produced can be from ketones in the brain, something like that.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty significant, like our body, like whether or not we like it or whether we like it or not, our body requires glucose for certain tissues. And if we don't consume them, it's going to make that glucose. And we'll talk about that in a little bit about the consequences of relying on that too much. But I also thought like central nervous system cells too, maybe.
Yeah, they I think they're slightly flexible, but they, like, kind of like the brain, they largely prefer glucose. And then the muscles, so the muscles are kind of a funny one because at rest they'll use like 80+% fatty acids. Same with, I think, like kidney, some of the more metabolic organs like kidney, liver is like super flexible. It's like the flexibility king. So it's actually hard to, like, I was reading some stuff because I forgot what the numbers were. Like, you sent me the topics to talk about, and I was like, okay, yeah. And I was like, oh, I forget what percentage of glucose or fatty acids the liver uses. And I'm not sure anybody has an answer to that question, because in the most artificial circumstances, like a hyperglycemic or a euglycemic hyperinsulinemic clamp, I think they could only get liver citric acid cycle. Somehow they were charting what percentage of what different macromolecule substrates were entering the citric acid cycle in the liver. And they could only get it to like maybe half. Yeah. And that's with like a really sort of forcing the issue with the glucose, like medically. So the liver uses a lot of fatty acids. It uses a lot of glucose. And that's actually probably the site of the most, well, of course, gluconeogenesis, because that's the tissue that does it. But even for its own energy, I couldn't get any real good numbers, but it's probably around a third if you're eating like a normal mixed diet, that it's using just amino acid, because it does all that recycling of amino acids. So it's kind of like the place amino acids go to die. And when it does that, like I said, it takes the carbon skeleton and uses it for energy and spits out the ammonia, either in the urea cycle or a couple other places, but that's where most of it ends up.
Yeah. So it seems like the liver is like the most metabolically flexible.
Yeah, unless it's diseased.
Yeah, that's true. And then you mentioned muscles. So muscles can do a lot of like fat oxidation in rest, like during sleep and when in between meals and resting. But then during exercise, especially like weight training, your muscles are going to preferentially burn or oxidize glucose for fuel. So there's very like throughout the body, like our body's going to switch off certain fuel types, especially for these more metabolic active ones.
Yeah. Muscle is a really good example of how the energy molecules are not just it's not just like you get ATP or whatever from this or that. It's that because glycolysis is so much faster than every other step in energy metabolism for something like anaerobic exercise, like weightlifting or sprinting or whatever, you just can't do it. You can't keep up any level. Like I did a video on that like last year, and I think I calculated, again, these numbers, these kind of basic numbers, which if I was going to write a textbook about like physiology or biochemistry, I would want these kinds of numbers and of course where they came from. But they're very hard to find. And I think I had to do my own math with a couple of different results that I found. But say you did like a weightlifting set, like maybe like a compound exercise, like squatting or whatever, close to failure. If you were just refueling your muscle, like the creatine phosphate and the ATP and stuff, to do another set like that, it would take like 10 or 15 minutes, like at the absolute fastest, to be able to do another set. Whereas, people can do it in like a couple minutes. I mean, depending on how trained you are,
right,
and what the exercise is, people can turn around pretty quickly with that. And you can also see it in sprinting. If you watch a flat out sprint, there is like clear drops in the speed that have to do with when one energy is sort of exhausted. It's almost like a baton being passed off in your body, right? Because all of those things, like ATP is being hydrolyzed, creatine phosphate is being hydrolyzed, and both of those are being resynthesized as they're being used by glucose, glycolytic, and the muscle is trying to spit out more glucose with glycogenolysis, and it's also doing some oxidative phosphorylate, metabolism, which is super slow, and it's taking up stuff from the blood. So all these things are happening. So it's like the ATP is kind of this like super good runner, but it has to constantly be like given the baton for, and then there's like creatine phosphate too. And then, and glucose is like pretty good at supporting those runners for, like 15-second sprint or something. But like fatty acids is just, it would be like the goofy, like if you're like running a race and like the fourth runner is just like Z level awful, and you're just like winning the race, and then you give it to them and they like drop the baton and like.
So there's no getting around that fatty acid oxidation is a little bit too slow. for some of these more like powerful movements and exercises.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The only argument is it okay to just get your muscle glucose and the glycogen stores from gluconeogenesis? That's really the only argument, because if somebody's on a ketogenic diet, that's what's happening.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, that's good because I think my diet's good.
Yeah. Like there's no getting around if you do like very explosive movements like sprints or weightlifting, like I used to do on a zero carb, low carb diet. Like your body has to perform a lot of gluconeogenesis because, like we were just saying, your muscles need glucose oxidation to perform these faster pace, more explosive movements. It wouldn't be possible for your body to keep up the proper pace.
Yeah, exactly. So that's coming from somewhere. That's coming from, depending on what your diet is. I mean, there's a limit, right? So if you are burning a certain amount of glucose, or amino acids as glucose or glucose equivalents, then that's coming out of protein that could be used for protein synthesis, and not just for muscle either, but I mean, like every enzyme in your body, and also the kind of secondary amino acid metabolism. Like there's just a lot of things that amino acids will tend to do,
Yeah.
and so they'll get pulled out of there. And then of course, like famously, Ray talks about catabolism of lean tissues, which it's the levels at which that happens depend on all sorts of things, like how deep into carbohydrate deprivation are you, and also hormonal status. Like if you like took exogenous testosterone or something, you can preserve your lean tissues better in that state. But some of it will happen because your body is kind of tuned to this survival thing. So your body doesn't care. Like if you're like, oh, I'm going to go on a cutting diet, I'm going to cut out carbs and I'll burn, fat from my adipocytes because I want to get rid of fat to look better on this cut, and I don't want to lose any muscle. So your body doesn't care about your like aesthetic goals necessarily. I mean, your body sees it. There's a certain amount of there's a certain rate at which it'll burn your fat and also burn some of your lean tissues. And what it sees in its kind of like wisdom as not that important. Like it won't go after your heart muscle right away.
Right.
That's saved for last.
Well, so speaking of that, like my concern for someone who is very low carb and they want to make sure that they're maintaining ketosis, right? And so oftentimes maintaining ketosis requires limiting your protein intake because too much protein can cause too much gluconeogenesis and you can kick yourself out of ketosis, right? So for people who want to be maintaining in ketosis, but then also working out, your body is going to use a lot of your dietary protein, your limited small amount of dietary protein, to make glucose for these mandatory organs that we talked about earlier that require glucose, like your red blood cells, just as an example. But then it's also going to make protein for like gluconeogenesis to be able to fuel your muscles during your workout. And then at what point are you don't have enough dietary protein to supply those needs? Thus, your body may return to your muscles, may break down your muscle catabolism in order to supply more protein and building blocks for your body. So it's like this really intricate balance of being able to supply enough glucose through gluconeogenesis for these mandatory functions, for working out to be able to supply your muscles with glucose, but then also having enough protein left over to build your body back up. And I don't know if anyone knows that ratio or is able to like coach anyone to like make sure that doesn't happen. I think that that's a slippery slope that someone could go down where their working out is thus just them breaking down their muscle tissue.
Right. Well, it certainly is acutely. I mean, the only question is like if they had a huge meal with a lot of protein overnight, would they like kind of replace that? I don't know the numbers, like all of those numbers off the top, but I do know the famous, like about 120 grams of glucose in the average human brain would be used per day. So if you think that's probably, that number is probably taken from somebody eating a normal, reasonable carbohydrate diet. So that's like basically 100% carbohydrate, 100% glucose, or derived from glucose. Of course, it's glucose because I said it's
So
glucose, but
someone who has a normal diet is thus, so their brain is then relying on 100% glucose.
yeah.
Okay, yeah. Versus.
Yeah. So if you just think like, well, what I'm saying is, so about 120 grams of glucose, right? Now that's when you're fueling your brain with pretty much 100% glucose. Now, if you're getting, let's be generous and say 50% of the energy from ketones.
Yeah.
So, but then energy per gram. All right, let's just, because I don't want to do the math right now. That's complicated, but let's just say you cut that down to 60. Okay. 60 grams of glucose per day, even if you're in like a ketogenic state for your brain.
Yeah.
So if somebody has to say eat 20 or 30 grams of carbohydrate or less to stay in ketosis, then that means the remaining whatever, if somebody actually did the math, like with the grams per energy of ketones versus glucose and got those grams correctly, whatever's left over, that's coming from amino acids.
Yeah.
That specifically amino acids that are, because it's not like the liver where it can take the alpha keto acid equivalent and throw it into the citric acid cycle, because the brain is taking these things up as glucose. So it's specifically glucose being made pretty much entirely in the liver, put into circulation and being taken up by the brain. So already, even in a totally ketogenic state, you're looking at like, something like a minimum of 30 grams, maybe more, 40 of glucose that is going to be come out of protein.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, and that's if you're eating like 20 or 30 grams of carbohydrates. If you're eating 0 carbohydrates, then all of this is just coming fully out of protein. And then that's not counting. Now, I don't have the numbers for red blood cells on what they consume, but of course they only consume glucose. A lot of the eye and, like you were saying, nervous tissue, especially the optics and certain other places that just don't get enough oxygen to fully oxidize and they have to do glycolysis. That's also consuming glucose that will come, if it's not coming from the diet, will come from dietary amino acids or in a pinch, catabolized lean tissue. So when you add all that up, I mean, it's easy to imagine at least 50, maybe 100 grams of amino acids just being pulled right out of your intake for these glucose equivalents, or in glucose proper in the case of the brain and the red blood cells. Yeah. So, if whatever you're eating, you're already like down by that much if you're not consuming glucose.
See, this is why I think this gets lost a lot, but this is why people say carbs are protein sparing. Because when you consume carbs, your body can then use those carbs for like non-negotiable glucose functions, and then it can use the protein to build your muscles, build other structures inside your body. So carbs are protein sparing because your body can use that protein for other things. Now, when I was on zero carb, like I did consume a lot of protein, like 160 grams of protein and a lot of fat. And so I was just high calorie. And I think that was important. I didn't lose muscle, but I don't think I was in ketosis all the time. But find me another person that is on low carb that is consuming high calorie. Most people are on low carb to lose weight. Mm-hmm. So it's like I think it's a very delicate balance to be able to find your ideal protein while not doing catabolism, while also trying to lose weight. I feel like that's a really tough thing to try to balance.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're doing weight training, so the like ballpark kind of probably incorrect, but definitely not incorrect at an order of magnitude, like somewhere within the ballpark estimate that I was just talking about. That would be for like a sedentary person. So if you're consuming, glucose equivalents in your muscles with explosive exercise, then it just goes up from there. And
Yeah.
of course, like ironically, those are the very people that want more amino acids for protein synthesis.
Yeah.
The people doing those exercises. So it's like the very it's like, oh, how deliciously ironic. Like the very amino acids that could be building your muscles are like being used to fuel your muscles to exercise, to like send the signal to your muscles to do protein synthesis.
Yeah. And not have many dietary protein remaining to be able to rebuild.
Yeah. And that's why, that's another reason people talk about like brain fog and all different kinds of issues, because the body, it's kind of like, at least it seems to me like when you're limiting things like this, whether you're just limiting straight up calories or you're limiting, cutting out one macronutrient, it just doesn't seem like that's what your body wants. And it kind of seems like a computer that like just doesn't quite have enough RAM, and it's like trying to decide like, or like compute, CPU power, like where to put it, it's like you open up your task manager and it's like 67% over here, and it's like everything's kind of slow and freezes for a second. And it's just not enough stuff. And that's really how I see, like, just stepping back big picture for a second, the ketogenic diet is sort of this philosophy that what I think is a survival mechanism, because people did have to go through times, especially at certain times in history and especially in certain geographic areas, where they didn't have access to X, Y, or Z, whether that's carbohydrates or even calories or like protein or iron. There's all kinds of things that people didn't have constant access to throughout our history. And so we have really elegant recycling systems or retention systems or backup energy systems, saying systems over. And obviously, like people would say, oh, because we can sort of not use glucose, which of course isn't really true, but you know what they mean, to survive. Oh, that's like the natural state, and having a constant supply of glucose is unnatural, and that's causing all these diseases. But it's sort of like saying because you can survive being like beaten and starved or something, and like, for some amount of time and then go back to a normal life, like the normal state is like being beaten and starved, because like we could survive that. It's like, yeah, we're designed to survive it, or else we wouldn't be here.
Right.
If there wasn't a system for something like ketosis, then any humans that didn't have, carbs for a few days would just be dead.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's like the goal that you should do, your diet that way.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's not.
Yeah.
It's just like there's an obvious explanation for the existence of these like backup systems.
Yeah. I have obviously changed my opinion on this, and for anyone that's been following us will know. I think that now an optimal thriving state is providing your body with carbohydrates so that you can spare protein, as an example, or perform these other functions. And we'll dive into like other things now, but neither of us are saying that you should be a high carb and a high fat person. That's what the standard American diet is, and that's like a recipe for disaster. But I personally am feeling a lot better, and I do think these arguments that you're bringing up make a great point that, hey, a moderate carb intake can be really beneficial and maybe more of a thriving state, so that your body doesn't have to rely on this other system that was maybe developed over time, because like you said, at some point in history, we didn't have access to carbohydrates. And I like how you compared it to iron too. Not many people know about the iron recycling system that we have that allows us to hold on to iron, because for some reason, at some point in our history, we didn't have access to dietary iron intake. And so now we only need to consume a smaller amount, and it's able to recycle a lot of the iron that we previously consumed. That was a good analogy. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. And you can also imagine, like, before there was a time when people didn't have any medical technology or like bandages or even understand arteries and veins such that we do now to like quickly stop bleeding.
Yeah.
So yeah, like, but people would get cut. I mean, people got cut more because they had more physical activity. They had to use their bodies more for things, and people would have injuries. So yeah, you can imagine all kinds of things like joint inflammation and the clotting, which is just another type of inflammation. It's like another expression of the same kind of monocyte reaction, just for a different tissue. These are all, things that would be like super useful if
Right.
you sprained your ankle or got a gash or something, and you're like, caveman, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So now I think if we can briefly review how these different energy substrates are oxidized, well, like the difference between them, because at some point in the cycle, like fat oxidation and carb oxidation are like pretty much similar, but a lot of the intro steps make things a lot different and create different environments. So I wrote down a few points that you bring up in the paper, but could you give like a brief overview of the difference between carb oxidation and fat oxidation? And like we brought up earlier, there's never going to be a single body that is only doing 100% one or 100% the other. Like at some point around our body, this is happening. These are both happening at different rates, but your dietary intake will dictate which one is being performed more, whether you're oxidizing more carbohydrates or oxidizing more fat.
Right. So the biggest difference is that glucose can go through that first glycolysis step and make 2 pyruvates. After that, it's pretty well. So what you get out of that is 2 ATP, in just the like you open up a biochemistry textbook. And that is the fast energy that you can get from glucose. And then once you have your 2 pyruvates, they go through something called the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex and get sent into the mitochondria with a coenzyme A as acetyl-CoA. And at that point, they lose a carbon to carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide that's lost in the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, which is 3 enzyme complex that turns pyruvate into acetyl, that is the difference in the respiratory quotient. Because you'll hear people say that the respiratory quotient for burning carbohydrates is 1, and for oxidizing fats, it's like just under 0.7. And that means the amount of CO2 divided by the amount of CO2 evolved divided by the amount of O2 consumed is 1. So it's 1 to 1. And that difference is from that first processing step that gets you a little bit of energy, but it's enough that that's what's really used to fuel the kind of anaerobic exercise. That's what glucose does for you. And yeah, once they're both made into, okay, so yeah, there we are.
Just as a note, like this is such a simplified version. Like metabolism in general is this like chaotic mess, and it's so complicated. This is just a very generalized version, but the point of this conversation isn't to like go through every metabolic pathway, just kind of give an overview of some of the differences between the two.
Yeah. So in the like that, that's the mitochondria, there, and outside of it, that's where the glycolysis happens and the pyruvate, goes in. And so that's where you get the 1 CO2 loss. And then you see in this TCA cycle, it also has CO2 coming out. I believe there's 2. Yeah, 2, because it's acetyl's 2 carbon unit. So you lose 2 CO2. So you produce for every unit of acetyl-CoA, which is like the basic unit that both glucose and fatty acids and the amino acid equivalents that can get put into the citric acid cycle at different points, create those. Since it's basically you take these energy substrates and you create into them a standardized 2 carbon high energy unit that's attached to a coenzyme that just facilitates its entry into this cycle. It's attached to a 4 carbon unit that then has to be regenerated, because now you have 6 carbons. Okay. So there's a 4 carbon unit that starts in the beginning of this, the TCA cycle. You add the acetyl to it. Now you have 6, and the whole cycle is taking those 2 carbons that you had added to it off. And that involves a lot of rearrangements. And as they're taken off as CO2. And as they're taken off, that releases energy. And that that energy is transferred as high energy electrons on hydrogen that gets attached to NAD to make NADH and FADH to make FADH2. And then those get sent to the electron transport chain. And this is where it gets a little dicey because there are some people like Ray, some of the people that Ray talk about, like Gilbert Ling, say that the way the electron transport chain happens is he would use the accounting the same way. Like he thinks ATP is very important, but for a different reason, and that it's produced in a different way. But, the classical explanation is that those high energy electrons attached to those basically energy transport molecules, kind of like a battery. In fact, a lot like a battery, because a battery is, a chemical that's pushed against its chemical gradient to store energy with electricity. So it's like a slow biological battery in there. And you send the current, more or less, of these high energy electrons through these carriers, and then they let them go through the enzymes of the electron transport chain. And then this drives a secondary sort of electrical system, except instead of electrons, it's protons, pumping protons up against its own gradient, concentrating them in between the inner and outer membrane of the mitochondria, and then letting them flow back through, which kind of like, and again, some people don't like this explanation and think that there's a different chemical process going on. But whatever's happening, you can just imagine sort of raising the energy level of one part of cellular machinery, sort of like a water mill. So imagine a stream of electrons feeding into a water mill that pushes the water up right in the buckets of like one of those water bucket things. And then once they're up there, they can be dumped, and you just raise that water against gravity. So that represents potential energy.
Yep.
And that's dumped and creates, in our system here, ATP. And just as the final accounting, so you get the same amount of ATP from an acetyl-CoA of any source. But the difference is, depending on how long a fatty acid is, it's broken down by 2 carbons at a time. So the amount of acetyl or acetate that it can make is just however is its chain length divided by 2, whereas glucose always makes 2. And all of the acetyl-CoA that derives from a fatty acid produces 2 CO2s, but all of the acetyl-CoA derived from glucose produces the 2 CO2s plus the extra one from the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex.
Plus this one.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was like a brief overview of like how it's somewhat similar pathways, and kind of like showing that, yes, our body can create energy, ATP, without glucose. But I like what you said at the end there, where like, let's take inventory. Let's discuss like, okay, yes, we can create energy using protein or fatty acids, but at what cost, right? So like, what are the differences if we take a look at the end of the energy cycle and look at the differences between starting with a glucose molecule versus starting with a fatty acid molecule? What are the resulting differences between that oxidation process to create energy? So I wrote down a few points, and I think if we can maybe go through some of these, I think that'd be helpful to understand, like, there are consequences for which energy molecule is being oxidized, which is being prioritized to be oxidized. So I think you touched on one of them, but one of the bigger ones that Dr. Ray P talks about, and you bring up in your paper as well, is like carbon dioxide production. So a lot of people think that carbon dioxide is just simply a byproduct, but Ray P talks about how carbon dioxide kind of acts like an antioxidant in the cells, and glucose oxidation results in more CO2 than fat oxidation. And I think I pulled this from your paper. Carbohydrate oxidation produces 50% more carbon dioxide than fat oxidation. And so increased carbon dioxide production resulting in increased oxygen entering the cell allows carbohydrates to support a higher metabolic rate than fats. So can you briefly touch on that point?
Yeah, there's like multiple levels to the CO2 thing. There's kind of the stuff everybody would agree on, like like the mainstream medical or scientific community, and then there's the more speculative stuff. So the stuff everybody would agree on is some simple things like you need CO2 because of the way oxygen is transported around in hemoglobin. You
Yeah.
need CO2 to get it, to knock off oxygens from that protein. So that's why hyperventilation is dangerous. If you have too much oxygen and no CO2 in your system, the oxygen will not be delivered to your cells. Now, with medicine, unfortunately, it's really it's easy to show acute effects. So, like if somebody's acutely hyperventilating, they can pass out. They could even have a seizure if their brain doesn't get oxygen long enough because there's not any CO2 to deliver the oxygen to the brain cells. I guess it could even be fatal. Whereas something that's chronic, like just having an average lower concentration of CO2 in your system over time than perhaps it would be otherwise, and a higher concentration of oxygen, it's a lot harder to show effects of that because that would be something over your lifetime. And that's where you get into the more speculative realm. But one thing to consider is that, so oxygen gas it's like a weak base, a chemical base, like a Lewis base molecule. And CO2 is like a weak acid. And if you'll notice, all of the parts of your body that are exposed to oxygen, to ambient oxygen, they're the things that have multiple layers of like dead cells, like stuff like your skin and hair, right? So everything that's exposed is either, with your eyes, it has like kind of like a fluid, like a membranous sort of protective thing, or it's got like basically layers of dead or dying cells to protect from, if you just expose your skin, like everybody knows, like you can't just expose, a living layer of skin, or like, if you peel back, like you torture somebody, like expose their muscles.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because oxygen is very reactive, and it's in the way of a base. So it would oxidize and mess up any tissues that weren't sort of designed to withstand that. And every level that you go from like the superficial to the deep of your body, and even into the level of intracellular, the protection is less. So you're getting more to like the delicate stuff. And also the level of CO2 is higher and the level of oxygen is lower. So the highest amount of oxygen we encounter is in air, and that's the lowest level of CO2.
Yeah.
And then in our blood, the oxygen is lower and the CO2 is higher. And then inside the cells, the oxygen is still lower and the CO2 is still higher. Some people claim that the CO2 inside your cells, or even inside mitochondria, is kind of like what atmospheric CO2 used to be in like ancient evolutionary history, because CO2 used to be a lot higher. And maybe that's why, there's these layers of protection, because there's this kind of like ancient sort of bacteria type thing inside of our cells, which is the mitochondria. Yeah. And they couldn't live in our oxygen world. So we kind of carry them around and like take the hits. And, but then similar to iron, right? So it's dangerous. It's very dangerous, but it's also necessary, because it is the ultimate oxygen, that is the ultimate acceptor of the sort of falling cascade of the high energy electrons that we use to harvest energy from these different energy substrates, fats, carbohydrates, etc.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the more like I said, speculative view of CO2, which is and N of O2. So they're kind of these partners, right? Is that CO2 represents like the most sort of reduced form of it's like the most acidic form of oxygen, and then oxygen is like the most basic, well, outside of hydrogen peroxide, and then you get into the really dangerous things, but in terms of like the not sort of pathological, just molecular oxygen.
So CO2 protects.
Yes, that's the idea. The idea is that in a way that would be kind of, you know, not measurable in some like clinical study for 3 months, but just having a higher average CO2 content in your blood, and especially inside your cells where all the stuff that could be attacked by molecular oxygen are, because the CO2 is floating around and it's kind of associating in it's dissolved in the water inside of cells, which again, very little of it is like bulk water, but it still does dissolve gases. There's, you know, dissolved gases floating around. And if there's something that can be attacked by oxygen, whether say it's like a polyunsaturated fatty acid that's studded in a mitochondrial membrane, the chances of that happening go down the less oxygen that isn't right now being used to accept electrons at the end of the electron transport chain. You know, so you don't want really molecular oxygen almost anywhere else unless it's being used. There's of course reactions all over the cell that require it, but if it's not being used, if it's just, you know, errant oxygen in your system, that's a danger to anything that is susceptible to a nucleophilic attack by molecular oxygen. And if there's a CO2 there instead, then it can't associate close enough to do the chemistry that would cause damage to that cellular constituent, and just multiply that times like a trillion over your lifetime.
Yeah.
And maybe that would result in like slower aging, for example.
Yeah. Well, so I've heard some people in the keto space say like, well, our bodies so tightly regulates our CO2 and our O2 levels in our blood and our body that consuming carbohydrates isn't going to make that much of a difference in our physiological levels of CO2. But has that been proven otherwise?
In the blood, there, I don't think you can really, like if you take somebody that's on, you know, a low carbohydrate diet and put them on a high carbohydrate diet, I don't think that always results in differential blood levels, because those are
Highly regulated.
Yeah, but that's not, there is a difference inside the cells. So it's just there's a certain flux.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the greenhouse effect. Like if the sun is sending a certain amount of energy to the earth, like that doesn't change, but you can like retain it for longer or less long depending on what the gases are in the atmosphere, you know, and that causes the heat to be different. So like if you think of it like, even if the amount, it's like, for example, people talk about the pH of the blood is tightly regulated. If it went out of whack too much, you would just start to have like serious issues right away. But that doesn't mean that the local pH in certain tissues or in certain cells is not like reaching pathological levels and causing these processes that add up over time, you know, to produce some type of disease state.
Okay.
Which again is the stuff that is almost impossible to like prove.
Right.
You know,
you can't monitor someone for X amount of years.
Yeah, and you can't like biopsy into a cell and be like, okay, how much CO2 is in this cell?
Right.
Like, I mean, you could do that with certain really large cells on a petri dish, but obviously that's not a body. You know, you just can't do some of these things. Like, it'd be nice if you could.
So this goes back to what we started at the beginning of the conversation with, which is some of these things you just simply can't test. And so you have to kind of just understand physiological processes to know like what the byproducts are and understand those as a base framework first, because you can't necessarily, it's just not possible to prove some of these things. But so if I briefly summarize the CO2 part, correct me if I'm wrong. So carbohydrate oxidation results in 50% more carbon dioxide as a byproduct, but you can view carbon dioxide as a good thing for a number of reasons. First, CO2 can almost act as like an antioxidant and protect against damage from these more harmful gases. And then the second reason, which we didn't touch on yet, is it allows us to increase our metabolism. It allows us to produce more energy because more CO2 allows for a more efficient delivery of oxygen, which means we can generate energy faster. We can go through that energy production faster. So you can generate, as a result of having more CO2 in our cells, we can generate ATP faster, and so therefore our metabolism is faster.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just better for the overall stream. Now there's a certain level at which, because if you put somebody in a tank and just pump in pure CO2, you'll kill them.
Right.
So just like anything else, there is like a sweet spot, and I don't know exactly what that is. A lot of people say they feel better if they do like bag breathing for a little while or practice trying to reduce. Yeah. You like slow down your respiration rate and just basically, and you'll also notice like, you can feel, at least I've subjectively experienced this. Like when I try to do something like that, you can feel kind of a warmth, a warming effect. Another thing that I noticed, I think Georgie said this years ago on one of the first podcasts with Danny, but if you have, if your nose feels stuffed up, but not necessarily with like mucus, just, sometimes the capillaries there kind of feel like if you pinch your nose closed and try to not breathe that much, and it'll build up CO2 and that dilates the vessels.
Yeah.
Because at every level, CO2 increases oxygen delivery. So it's at the level of hemoglobin, and it's also at the level of vasodilation. And then it's at the, it's at the level of hemoglobin at the cells where the oxygen is being dropped off, and also at the lungs where it's being picked up.
So at the cellular level, and then also at like the organ level, people have also talked about how like CO2 can be beneficial for like recovery because it improves vasodilation to a certain location.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you could like locally, and I think Ray tells a story. I mean, who knows, but he says like a little girl when he was younger, like got her finger, like the last bit of her finger cut off, and somebody just put, it wasn't like real medical care, but somebody just put like a cap over it to stop it from bleeding. And it was, I guess, pretty tight and didn't allow a lot of gas exchange. And he said the high CO2 pressure that built up there allowed now I'm sure if it was cut lower, because like any kind of tissue regeneration in humans, the best bang for your buck is just regenerating a little bit, right? So like how far down you chop your finger off, like your mileage may vary. Yeah. And also your age, right? So like if you were a really little kid, you're closer to that state in utero where you can regenerate really, really well.
Metabolism.
Right. And high CO2 pressure.
Yeah.
In the womb, which, so, but yeah, he claims that this little girl, I forget how old, like had basically her finger heal and regenerate like such that it didn't even really have a scar because of this capping and the high CO2 pressure that was just kept there for like however long she had it on.
Yeah. Okay, so to return, so improved like recovery vasodilation because it improves like higher CO2 in a certain area allows for more efficient oxygen delivery, oxygen delivery to cells and then also to tissues. But then briefly to touch on like how CO2 improves your metabolic rate because there's again more oxygen delivered, and so that energy production cycle can go faster. So this directly refutes what a lot of people in the keto space say, that fat is a more efficient fuel source. The ATP yield obtained from lipid oxidation is over 2 times the amount obtained from carbs. So can you kind of explain that contradiction? Like those are just completely two competing statements.
Yeah, well, it's comparing apples and oranges, because a molecule of glucose, for whatever biochemical universal reason, life on Earth, organic beings and entities and molecules sort of decided that simple, like, carbohydrate molecules would have 6 carbons. I don't know. They just do. Now, of course, there's ones that are smaller and bigger, but overall, the sort of energy currency of most living things is glucose, or one of its sort of similar, something like fructose, which is just kind of flipped around a little bit, but it's still 6 carbons. Whereas for whatever reason, fatty acids, which are put together differently, so they have less oxygens, which is why they require more oxygen to produce the same amount of CO2, they vary widely in their length. And 6 carbons would be a very short fatty acid. And most of them are in the like 10, actually most of them dietarily would be like in the 14 to 18 carbon length range. And then the ones that are the more, like your DHA and like EPA and all that stuff gets into the low 20s and even the mid 20s, 24. So to take one fatty acid and one glucose and compare them is retarded, because it's what you should be comparing is like energy per carbon, or energy per acetyl CoA derived, carbon, like derived from that energy substrate. Right. So it's just kind of a stupid thing to say. It's like trying to compare, like an electric car battery versus a gas tank. I mean, there's obviously, at the current technology, right, like batteries have a pretty limited ability. Like it would be super ridiculously expensive to have a battery that could hold the amount of electricity that would take a car the same distance as like a normal fuel tank for gasoline. That's right. Just where we are now. Who knows if that'll ever change? I don't know. I'm just saying it's a dumb comparison. Everybody realizes that that's just the trade-off there, right? Is that like, but of course, electric motors can accelerate faster. Except, I mean, I don't want to get, there's certain like RPM ranges where internal combustion can be faster at some speeds. But anyway, so it's just comparing apples and oranges. It's not relevant that, because the actual production of ATP, like whether you're talking about per second or per oxygen being used, per any of the stuff that's relevant, per, like I said, per carbon, like per organic carbon, is not that different. It's just that fatty acids are just a bigger molecule. So it's like if glucose was 9 carbons instead of 6, or 12 instead of 6, then it would produce twice as much ATP per glucose. But it's 6. Right. So it's just like it's kind of like saying the dollar is worth more than the peso. But then it's like, well, okay, what if the peso is like the cent?
Yeah.
It's like you could call your currency whatever you want and say this is worth more than this.
Yeah.
Like all that really matters is like the average person who has a job, the money they get, can they buy more stuff than the average person in the other country getting paid in that currency? Like that's kind of a more like relevant measure. Because like if I got paid 1 billion pesos a year, then that's awesome. Like, and if somebody gets paid like 30,000 American dollars, then like I'm way better off, even though they'd be like, oh, the peso is not worth anything. It's like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Right. Oh, that's a good way to think about it. But I also think another way to think about it, you were saying fatty acids are just like longer chains, right? But you hear people say that like, oh, MCT oil improves your metabolism. It keeps your metabolism fast, which no one's denying that. Like even Ray Pete, Georgie talk about that too. Like MCT oil, smaller fatty acid chain improves your metabolism. Mm-hmm. Glucose and MCT have similar length structures. So they're kind of similar, but then other fatty acid structures are a lot bigger than MCT. And so that kind of helps put things in perspective too. Like why would people say MCT oil improves your metabolism if it's such a smaller chain length relative to other fatty acids?
Yeah. And it's the way that it's different than the longer chain fatty acids is that it's more like glucose. So they're kind of saying like like medium and shorter chain fatty acids are better. And then they're leaving out like in parentheses, because they're more because they adopt some of the properties of glucose, because they get, like, for example, they get into the mitochondria faster.
Right.
So, and same thing with ketones, by the way. They say, oh, ketones are the best fuel. And it's basically because ketones, again, sort of mix some of the properties. Actually, they're ketones are sort of like the like last step before actually just like the acetyl, like from the acetyl CoA. So they're like very pre-processed.
Yeah.
So that's why they're a good fuel, is because all of that work that, again, and this is just like a universal thing that life on Earth kind of developed, right? Is that fats are this storage. And it makes total sense because, yes, why, if fatty acids were both more dense, which they are, they can be stored with less water. So like per, pound of body weight, you have more calories in fat stores than in other stores. And well, that's basically like, so they're denser. So if they were denser and faster, why would we even have glucose? Right? It doesn't make any sense. It's like, how you have to, it's sort of like if you had a tool, like you're trying to do a job and you have like, screwdrivers and hammers and stuff. If you have one tool that does the job of itself and another tool better than the other tool, then just get rid of the other tool. Why would you have it?
Right.
We have screwdrivers because they're better at turning screws than hammers. Like you can turn a screw with the claw of a hammer if you're desperate. I mean, you're like sitting in a room that's like, so I'm sure you've done like construction recently. Tools can substitute for each other.
Right.
In a pinch. And sometimes actually you shouldn't, because it's dangerous and you can hurt yourself. You can damage the tool, you can mess things up. But sometimes if you know what you're doing, you can use a tool that's designed for one thing and kind of adapt it for another purpose if you don't have that specialized tool.
Right.
But the point is, the specialized tool would be better. So yeah, so for storing long-term, like emergency large amounts of calories, fat is better than glucose. Like that's, I'm comfortable saying, like, I'm a pro glucose person, but I'm comfortable saying that because that's just how it is. The same way as amino acids can do a bunch of things that fat and carbohydrates can't do, like, and not just make, proteins, but like other aspects of metabolism.
Yeah.
And they're all needed.
Right.
And it's just really silly to think like, oh, like the low carb people or keto or whatever, like I don't know what the most common moniker is right now.
Right.
But it's like they think of glucose as a nuisance, maybe a necessary evil would be like the enlightened perspective. Like, oh, well, you do need some of it. It's just we want to kind of eliminate as much. Like they think of it as like vices, like, oh, we can't get rid of all gambling, but let's try to like have as little as possible and like keep it away from the children. And that's just like when you're talking about biological molecules that like, life has been using for all this, it's just kind of a stupid way to think of it. Now, if you're thinking of toxins like gamma rays and mercury and stuff that's like doesn't have much of a track record of being very useful to organic beings, then yeah, we should just go ahead and try to limit that.
Right. Yeah. Well, you hear the argument all the time, like glucose in the low carb space, that carbs are the only non-essential macronutrient for us. Like we don't need to consume it because our body can make all of the carbs that it needs from our dietary fat and protein. I don't think we dived into that enough. So can we talk about some of the potential consequences of relying entirely on gluconeogenesis to get the carbs that our body needs?
Well, I think we kind of talked about it. It's just basically that it produces more ammonia.
Yeah.
Which there's just really no good reason for that. And depending on what's going on, and like you said, I mean, unfortunately, you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, because if you try to get your energy by eating more protein, then you're doing more gluconeogenesis. So that requires, of course, the stress hormones So you're ramping up that system like cortisol, and you're producing more ammonia. And then if you try to limit your dietary protein, to try, to stay in ketosis and try to get ketones to be a more, just have that be as much of an energy source for you as possible, then you're getting to that sort of tough choice for your body where it starts being like, yeah, but I still need to do some gluconeogenesis and I still need to do protein synthesis. And now is a problem.
Yeah.
And that's really the two main problems. And both of those systems, I mean, whether you're limiting protein to go more towards ketones or you're being more liberal with protein, you're still running stress hormones. It's just what's happening in the liver is different because it's either being overwhelmed with fatty acids so that it can't even do beta oxidation fast enough. And that's when it turns on the ketogenic sort of system and starts exporting those. Or it's just doing more and more and more amino acid metabolism and catabolism.
Yeah. So I think that's an important point you brought up, the stress pathways. So again, this returns back to our intro conversation where like kind of fighting about studies doesn't necessarily always lead us to like an end agreement or end place. And understanding the physiological principles is an important thing. Can you talk briefly like how activating the stress pathways and the stress hormones are just unavoidable for gluconeogenesis?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are trying to just not call them stress pathways anymore because they want their preferred metabolic system to be like normalized, so to speak, like in the culture. So like, I guess it would be offensive to call cortisol or hormone sensitive lipase or sort of anything that like, ramps up liberating fatty acids from adipocytes, turning up gluconeogenesis and, liver export of glucose and liver export of fatty acids. Anything that does that would be considered like good to them. So, but I mean, it's just a fact that cortisol and epinephrine, which are the two sort of main drivers of those of releasing fatty acids and turning up gluconeogenesis, are also turned up like from, things normal people call stress, like getting like some homeless guy screaming in your face as you're walking down the street, or like being chased by an animal, being frightened, being sleep deprived. All of those things also turn up those same hormones. Yeah. So, and starvation. So at a certain point, you look at the things that cause that like hormonal profile in the body and the overall physiological profile, and they seem to be all like bad things. Yeah. So, and there's this argument, and it does make kind of a certain kind of sense that maybe we're designed to have this cyclical bad thing. Like some people might fast once a week or something, or have like their own take on, because obviously some amount of stress, and I don't know if we talked about this last time, but like eliminating stress would be kind of like being in a bubble, and like not moving or whatever. And that's a tough sell. Like that doesn't, it's not even really living. But on like, if you're, say your body's not being exposed to gravity and your muscles start to atrophy, and that's actually bad for like all your organs. Like you need the stress of gravity, and you need certain things to, because we've evolved and are designed to withstand those things and to sort of push against them. And that's how our physiology works. It just doesn't seem like chronically having the systems elevated that are the systems that are elevated from acute problems like something really scary or dangerous happening or starvation makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I think that is it hard to like track that, because I don't know if there's many studies saying or proving that being in a ketogenic state leads to long-term like activation of these stress pathways. There's some argument out there that like those stress hormones get normalized at some point when you become like fat adapted. And so I think that's the biggest pushback that I've received from others, is that like, okay, that's great that gluconeogenesis requires, and being in the state of ketosis requires activation of the stress pathways, but there's no studies documenting that those levels are elevated in humans.
Yeah, I have seen that too. But the funny thing about it is there's these two literatures, right? There's the one literature, and it's not very big, but yeah, somebody might point to a handful of studies where it's like, hey, you know, look at this. It's great. Actually, when people adapt to this ketogenic diet, their cortisol kind of goes closer back to normal. And, you know, it doesn't look so bad. Their blood doesn't look so bad. It doesn't look like they're constantly being chased by a tiger or whatever you'd expect from a chronic stress state. However, there's a sister literature and also enormous amounts of anecdotes online, if you follow these people, of so-called like adrenal fatigue, where, you know, there's a constellation of symptoms and then also measured signs in like cortisol and say being like unable to produce enough that people that are on a ketogenic diet for like years seem to get. So on the one hand, it's like, it seems like their hormones start to go down, but is that because their body's getting used to it, or it's just not able to keep up that level? And it does find a way, you know, like, cause for example, every hormone, you know, uses a type of receptor system, and you can have the same amount of signaling by making the receptors more sensitive or less sensitive, or changing the downstream molecules that are activated or deactivated by those receptor systems. It's a whole thing, right? So like with steroids and stuff, like you generally, if you took like an anabolic steroid, you will get a boost in anabolic signaling, but the receptors will also get kind of turned down a little bit. And whether that means that their downstream phosphorylation events are reduced, or some of them get internalized and destroyed. So the cell will like put out more receptors when it is like, oh, there's not enough like signaling ligand, and it'll pull some back. So I haven't looked too much into this, but I'm imagining what's happening is there's this for X amount of time, these people are running on this stress system, and then eventually the body normalizes to it by increasing like adrenergic receptor and other systems to run on a lower level of the actual hormone itself. But it's still the same system. It's the same way that if you could double the sensitivity of anabolic steroid receptors, you would get the same effect as being on steroids. Or like say if you could multiply times 10, but your body's still producing the same amount of testosterone, right? You would still get an enormous effect. It would be like steroids. So then these people find that they start having these symptoms that they begin to classify as adrenal fatigue, which to me is perfectly consistent with a system where your body has sort of upregulated its sensitivity to these things, because it's been like, okay, we've got these ligands sitting. Like, why would you have like hormones are usually in the like micromolar range, sometimes even lower. So if your kidneys are putting out a certain, like, I'm just going to throw out numbers. These are not the real numbers.
Okay.
Let's just say 20 micromolar in the blood of cortisol to achieve a certain blood sugar. Okay. That would be like your acute level. And if your body all of a sudden realizes this is just my life now, why would it continue to produce and export that much cortisol? Why wouldn't it downregulate that? Or why wouldn't it have an evolved system to downregulate that by upregulating, whether it's the actual cortisol receptor sensitivity, the receptors that directly interface with cortisol, or any of the dozen or more downstream steps that get to the actual effects of, you know, turning on the enzymes for gluconeogenesis, keeping them going, keeping the export of glucose, and all of those things.
Yeah.
But that's like, again, that's something that I would bet if you really looked into it for a while, and hopefully one day I can do this because it's an interesting thing to like maybe write an essay about and get those numbers and find studies where the tissues were looked at in that way and the endocrinology and the molecular biology of these receptor systems was measured for kinetics and changes. But again, the clinical, like the fact that somebody's cortisol, now, if it was just that if it was that their body just went back to pre whatever, like normal carb consuming levels of all these hormones, and people didn't complain of this like adrenal fatigue thing, and they didn't have these long-term issues, then I might not be so suspicious.
Yeah.
But these long-term issues pop up, both, like I said, anecdotally and also in the medical literature, like whether it's case studies or actual studies with a larger sample population, where there seem to be issues with the adrenal, hormone systems from this chronic, like zero carb or whatever.
So then why do you think that, like, for example, it's like Sean Baker, like, how do you think that they're able to be zero carb or low carb for like 10 years?
Well, I've met people that have been zero carb for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think some people can do it. And it depends what their expectations are and where they start. Like if you start really sick and you're like 40 and then you do it for 10 years and you're 50, you might feel better than you felt when you were sick and 40. If you're like, especially if you're consuming high quality, like a nose to tail, carnivore type diet and things like that. And maybe doing other things to improve your health as well. Because
if you were consuming like a high fat and a high carb diet, like the standard American diet, I think like any improvement in your diet will make you feel so much better.
Right. So I think most people will hit a wall where they will start to feel worse than when they started. That time could be, it's the same thing with like a B12 thing. There's probably people that could go vegan and start to get some pretty bad symptoms of B12 deficiency like within a year.
Yeah.
And there's some people that it would take 10 years. I don't want to like make accusations, but let me just say that what I was talking about before with like anabolics, I wouldn't be surprised if some influencers that have, personally, in my opinion, it's not really achievable to have a certain level of physique, even just outside of low carb, like even just without some type of exogenous hormonal assistance at like 50.
Yeah.
And if you've been around like weight rooms and training and stuff for a long time, and you've seen people that are natural and people that are on this diet and that diet, and dozens of people, and people that are genetically gifted for physiques, and then people that take things, you start to get an eye for those types of things. I mean, there's always freaks out there. There's always genetic freaks, like a 1 in a million person who can look like a professional bodybuilder and not be on steroids. Like there have been a couple of people like that have popped up over the years. But again, I mean, if that's true of that one guy, then that's just the exception that proves the rule, because who else looks like that at that age on a zero carb diet?
Right. Right.
Even the D'Agostino, is it Stina? I always forget. Dominic D'Agostino. It's D'Agostino or Ni. It ends in an O or an I. No. I always forget, and I don't mean to be disrespectful.
D'Agostino.
Okay, it ends in an O. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know if his physique is still the way it is if you like Google image search pictures of him, but he had like a really impressive physique.
Yeah.
And I've just always maintained that he built that level of lean tissue with carbs. Maybe he maintains it without carbs, but you cannot build that without carbs.
Like even like Thomas Delore, who has a pretty good physique, but he built that previous diet on a previous diet with carbohydrates. And then maybe if someone is like, I don't know, they, like you said, they can maintain that on a keto diet. I personally saw that like my strength was going down at a certain point. Like I reached that wall, and I was like comparing my training numbers to before I went low carb, and it was declining at a certain point. So I definitely reached, like you said, I reached my wall. But I think this whole discussion about gluconeogenesis and ketosis, it comes down to what type of physiological system you believe is good. So it comes down to this base level of do you want a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism? Do you believe in the rate of living theory where like we want to slow our system down and a slower metabolism will lead to longer lifespan because we're only allowed X, Y, Z heart rates. And so if we use those up quickly, we die young. Or do you believe in kind of more the bioenergetic, the Ray-Peat thing, where the faster metabolism, the better we are at energy production, the better we can maintain our structure, the better we can recover, and we will have a longer and better health life. And so it's like two different base theories as to what you believe is the better path. And then you have to make that decision first and then follow a specific pathway. Because if you try to like interject ideas at higher up levels, like you get lost in the literature with all the different competing things, and you have to return back to kind of what you view as good for long term.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of it kind of in a third way where, I mean, there is a limit. Like you can't ramp up like as humans, you know, and like any animal and any organism like has a limit to how low their metabolism can go until they're dead, how high it can go.
Absolutely.
And all. Yeah. So there's like a target range.
Yeah.
And that's just what it is. It's kind of like, or like with weightlifting, like you can't just infinitely get stronger forever. Like there are limits, you know, our physical bodies have limitations, sucks. But yeah, to the idea, and there is hard literature about this, even mainstream, like the uncoupling proteins thing, where when your body is replete with energy, it will express these proteins that kind of seem to make the energy production system in the mitochondria less efficient. And so it drives energy substrate through faster to produce actually the same amount of energy, but it kind of burns it up faster with these uncoupling proteins. And that this reduces the production of reactive oxidative species in the mitochondria, which is always a danger, because there's very powerful oxidative and reduction, you know, transfers happening. And like I think, you know, if there's, for example, polyunsaturated fatty acids in the mitochondria, it creates even more of a danger. But there's, you know, anything can be oxidized by a peroxyl radical. So, but actually, you might think slowing down, because there are some processes, like when you're doing something like you're cutting vegetables, you're less likely to cut yourself if you're going slower than fast, right? But that doesn't necessarily translate inside the cell. Like maybe running things through faster gives partially processed intermediary reactive products less of a chance to get away, you know, to just leak out.
Right.
And that would be just a philosophical with evidence reason why running something faster could be safer. And actually, when you're cutting vegetables, I mean, if you're used to, like, if you're one of those trained chefs and you have a certain speed that you have done it for 20 years and you try to do it slower, maybe that could be more dangerous. You know, like sometimes you're just used to doing, like we have muscle memory as humans. And like, if you mess with that, it seems like it would be safer to do it slower, but maybe not.
Yeah. Well, okay, wait. So just to touch on what you were saying, a lot of people argue that like the faster that we create energy, just as an example, the more likely things can go wrong and the worst byproducts that could happen as a result. And so that's one reason to make sure that we try to slow our metabolism down to improve our aging. But I think it's always important to consider, like, I think there's a lot of unknowns with aging. I was listening to a podcast with Dr. Attia the other day, and he even said, like, we don't know the marker for aging yet. Like that is not known. And there's a lot of unknowns about the human body and aging. And so a lot of these theories and ideas are still not like 100% proven yet. But it seems like there really are two different viewpoints on terms of the metabolic speed. And like you were saying, at a certain point, a good fast metabolism can maintain its structure better. And so it doesn't allow any like potential bad byproducts out of the cell to leak out, as an example.
Yeah, that's one example. Another example is generation time. So like eukaryotic cells, like what we're made of, have a much slower rate of dividing than most prokaryotic cells like bacteria. And we can produce more energy. And they have a different strategy where, like, if something changes in their environment, they can respond really fast because they can divide and grow really fast if there's a lot of stuff present. And whereas we can change less fast.
Yeah.
And one of the things that that has been shown pretty clearly is that cancer cells have more, so bacterial cells have more liquid water in them, especially when they're about to divide. Our cells have more liquid water in them when they're about to divide. And cancer cells have chronically more water in them, and they divide faster and they produce less energy. And they do it mostly with glycolysis compared to regular healthy cells. This can be seen in MRIs, and cells that are stressed have more water in them and produce energy less well and do more glycolysis and less full oxidation of energy. So if you put all that together, an actual kind of like a steady, less dividing cell, but a cell that actually lives in that intermediary phase of its life longer, you can imagine as using things up less than tissues that have cells that are constantly dividing. But that's the effect of stress, and also seems to be the sort of strategy and the rate of living way for organisms that produce energy less efficiently, ones that don't have mitochondria, that don't do full oxidative metabolism like we do, and can't actually harvest energy quite as efficiently. So it's like if cells aren't getting enough energy and producing it fast enough, then that could perhaps induce some of them to actually grow and divide faster, which is something that somebody just, might think of like that's associated with aging, right? Because like once you've reached maturity, you kind of want to just like maintain.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So if we can kind of summarize some of the things, and then as we summarize the points, if you think of anything else of like the potential consequences, feel free to just stop me. But no one is saying that like ketones aren't a great fuel source. Ketones are a great fuel source, as you said. They're like quick energy. So your brain does probably feel good on ketones. I remember mine did. But there's like a potential cost to the ketone production. And would you say that one of the biggest costs is activation of the stress pathway? Like you can't produce ketones without activating the stress pathway.
Yeah, for sure.
Like that's just physiology.
Yeah, because the ketone production requires an amount of fatty acid uptake by the liver that spills over its capacity for beta oxidation of those fatty acids. And that can only happen from the influence of things like epinephrine that release enough fatty acids from adipocytes or from dietary intake or wherever it's coming from to overwhelm those systems. And if you're consuming enough carbohydrates, unless you have a really bad disease state like diabetes or something, your liver is not going to get overwhelmed by fatty acids in that way and start to produce physiologically relevant levels of ketones.
So I think that's an important thing to like keep in mind is you won't be able to reach ketone production unless you are like consume enough fatty acids or are producing or breaking down fatty like your own tissue fat. So it's when your liver becomes like almost overwhelmed with fatty acids, and then it has to activate this other pathway to create ketones.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's just like turning on a backup generator.
Yeah.
And nobody does that when the regular lights still work, from the power from the cables outside.
See, but this is my whole thing with like keto. I think that if someone feels good on it and reducing or eliminating a macronutrient allows them to make better food choices and they feel fine, like that's great. But I kind of have now obviously changed my opinion that like I no longer think that is like the most optimal pathway. I think that if you can better control the way that you eat and control the food that you consume, you can still feel great while not having these potential like stress activation pathways. So you can achieve the same benefits by not just eating a bunch of crap food. So like, of course, you're going to feel better than consuming high fat and high carb, like donuts, pizza, muffins, like things like the standard American diet.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you feel better with keto, like eliminating those and you can make better food choices, that's fine. But I think the main point of this conversation was there could potentially be a way that you feel even better by like lowering your activation and not requiring the stress pathways as much if you're able to better control your food choices and have a good like healthy carbohydrate sources, still consuming fatty acids because fats make up the membranes in our body and we need fats, and then also of course protein, like we said. So that's my thing. Like if someone really does like feel better and it helps them make better food choices, then like more power to you. But I think I used to have this like superiority complex that like being in ketosis and fasting and low carb was like somewhat superior. Like I really did. And I don't want to project that same mindset with like my current way of eating. I just want to have discussions with people about presenting an alternative viewpoint on what we had before.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with vegetarian. Like there's plenty of people that go from a really crappy diet to a vegetarian or even a vegan diet, and that could be better, at least for a while. I mean, with vegan, I think it's pretty touchy, but I mean, if you're consuming like eggs and dairy, if you're eating, say, like a home cooked, more whole food diet as a vegetarian versus a total junk food, like convenience store mixed omnivorous diet, it's probably better, but it would be better still if you could include like animal foods in that more like real food diet.
Right. And then also if someone has like a disease state and the state of ketosis is actually like helping them, like that's a completely different story. But I would say like now that keto is hitting like mainstream, like most people don't like keto. It's always helpful to keep in mind that like ketosis was developed for like epilepsy treatment, and most people don't have these states. And I think a lot of people turn to ketosis and keto for like weight loss, or like, I don't know, improved energy. But again, you're going to have a lot improved energy relative to like standard American diet or like a diet that's heavy on like nuts and seeds and things like that. And then the other point we brought up was like burning carbohydrates, oxidizing carbohydrates results in more CO2, and that can have a few downstream benefits like more like protecting the cell, acting as like an antioxidant, and then also supporting a higher metabolic rate. Like you said, there's not like this, it's not a linear pathway where like the more carb you consume, the better your metabolic rate. There's a cap that we can all reach, right? Like our genetic potential of our metabolic rate. It'll just help support a higher metabolic rate, like how people in the keto space say that like MCT oil does that as well. So it's kind of a similar thing. And then one thing that we didn't touch on as much, but when someone is relying entirely on fat oxidation, they will be consuming a hefty amount of PUFAs. So I think it would be a different story if someone was able to somehow consume only saturated fat and oxidize saturated fat entirely. But oxidizing PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, there's consequences to that. And we talked more about that in our PUFA discussions. Make sure you guys check out that one. It's always helpful to keep in mind that growing up, a lot of us likely consumed a bunch of PUFAs. And so we may have a lot of stored PUFAs in our body. And so if you aren't consuming enough food, your body will eventually break down those PUFAs, and PUFA oxidation in a fat burning state can have like negative consequences. You may not feel as great.
Yeah. And also not just not feel as great, but just contributing to a lot of not noticeable. I mean, like you don't feel radiation, but that like if there's like some 25% more like oxidative damage events in your cells, you might not feel that for a while, but that could cause all kinds of pathologies.
Yeah. And then the other final point was just this idea of like working out and building muscle. It can be really challenging to find that like protein level where you're still able to supply your body with the glucose that it needs while also still having protein to spare to build muscle. There's not too many examples of people who have been able to build a big physique on keto. I would say like Keto Savage, Robert is his name. Keto Savage is definitely an exception there. Like he has built muscle on keto. But then, like you said, there's other examples of people who have had great figures that they built with carbohydrates and then have maintained with ketosis.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most, it's not necessarily health oriented, but like the bodybuilding community online is one of the most rigorous and empirical, like, bro scientific communities. And if they have kind of in their collective wisdom concluded that something works, like, for example, consuming carbohydrates, that's true. Like these people take a lot of health risks with the kind of drugs they experiment with the kind of diets they experiment with. So, and the consensus of the bodybuilding community is, through things like, I mean, because they see insulin as good because insulin is very, involved in muscle, the protein synthesis and driving amino acids into muscle tissue to feed protein synthesis there. So they have that kind of a perspective. And I mean, you got to respect that. Like, again, not that everything bodybuilders do, or even most things they do is healthy,
Right.
but if you're talking about how to produce lean muscle, efficiently, just like whatever, they probably have the answer.
Yeah.
And there's definitely not professional bodybuilders that are keto. That will never happen.
Yeah. But I think it is always important. Like there's more, I don't know, at a certain age, some people may not be interested in building muscle anymore. And like, there's
of course,
more than like building muscle. But in this conversation, we talked a little bit about how activating the stress pathway long-term. So if you do it intermittently, I don't think that that's going to be a problem at all. But if you're like chronically in ketosis for a very long period of time and are chronically relying on the stress pathway, that can lead to downstream negative health effects. I don't think anyone would agree that like having elevated stress levels, which is, like you said, it's hard to measure because maybe the your body like adjusts by increasing receptor sites and things like that. Like you don't know.
Well, it's the same thing we talked about with when I was saying in the last conversation, the omega-3 literature has decided that an upregulation of like superoxide dismutase and enzymes that deal with oxidative stress is a good outcome.
Right.
So it's on a certain level, if you don't have really fast, obvious clinical outcomes to measure, and you have to measure like cellular physiology or like biochemistry or endocrinology or whatever, a lot of this is good, this is a bad outcome, this is a good outcome is narrative based and like from kind of a silly, like that's silly.
Right.
Right. to say that's to like, it's like, oh yeah, we may have like more fires occurring, but like it's caused us to have more fire extinguishers installed. So like, this is a good, like it's whatever's causing these fires is good because now we have more fire extinguishers. It's like, no, like that's not like fire extinguishers are cool and all, but like, it's good to just not have the fires.
Right. It just like reduces the debate to just like back and forth of studies. And that kind of doesn't really get us anywhere.
Yeah. And there is a perspective that I could see somebody forwarding where they're like, well, I actually do think that a certain amount of this oxidative stress that causes perhaps an overreaction in the production of antioxidant enzymes is good. And then we could have the conversation like, well, okay, is there evidence that's good chronically or acutely, or, but to somebody just kind of do the gotcha, like, oh, look, well, I Google search, I can tell. All right, now we're getting like arguments online, but like I could tell when people, because they'll take a certain amount of time to get back to me, and I can tell they're just Google searching for like a paper that has a title that disagrees with me.
Right.
That I do not respect.
Acute versus like long term is something really important to keep in mind, and I didn't really think about that before. Like before, when I was low carb and zero carb, like we still don't have long-term data because, like you said, it's really challenging to have long-term lifespan human data.
Yeah. I mean, the longest term data we have is epidemiology, which is like this population level kind of gross, as in like gross anatomy, like a not
Yeah.
fine.
Right.
And then the fine stuff is the shortest term stuff. So, you can't just say the fine stuff is better than the gross stuff. And you also can't say the long-term stuff is always better than the short. Like you slide up and down your scale. And of course, I mean, there are some study designs that just suck. And you can just say this study sucks.
Yeah.
But in terms of a well-designed study, whether you're looking at a cell line, yeah, I mean, that might not apply to a whole person or even a whole animal. But there are things you can ask of that cell line that you can't ask of a whole body. And those conclusions should be respected if you can consistently show something, like show something at a certain population level and at an individual level. And then maybe it doesn't show up in a clinical study of 3 weeks, but if you have a good reason for that and you can support that reason by a couple lines of evidence, then now you have something,
Yeah.
instead of just going back and saying, well, this says this says this. Like you have to kind of do a synthesis to really talk. And that's what really people, because that's a lot of work.
Right. Right.
And nobody wants to, people just want to argue. And like, I mean, everybody knows like essentially people are looking to confirm their biases rather than like seek the truth when they're debating, especially when they're debating, because you get into that combative mode and it's just,
Yeah. Okay. One more thing I just remembered. One trend that you sometimes see for people who are like long-term keto or long-term low carb is that they're like fasting, the blood glucose elevates, like it just keeps getting higher and higher. What do you think the main reason for that could be?
I think that it's like the fast effect of that diet, which is just pulling the body's previously known source of glucose, which is of blood glucose, which is from the diet. You're taking that out. So that results immediately in just a lower average, whether it's fed or fasting, because you're not taking in dietary glucose anymore, blood glucose. But you are setting into motion these longer term endocrine changes, through what we were saying, the stress hormones and perhaps the resistance or the reorganization of the endocrine system to deal with a chronic role of those stress hormones rather than the acute role that I think they were sort of intended for. And then also you're building up fatty acids all over the place, whether it's, in the liver making ketones or in all the tissues that can use fatty acids over time and over time and over time, which themselves directly, just the presence of fatty acids directly oppose insulin. So any glucose that you have is going to be taken up slower, whereas the liver is going to keep exporting a certain amount. And over time, you're just going to kind of, because that initial effect of just ripping out dietary glucose, that happens right away. And then your glucose is going to be really low, perhaps even dangerously low, but at least much lower than before. But then this other very long-term effect will just build up over time, and you're building up an insulin resistance that is going to express itself as just the way any other insulin resistance does. It just takes a very long time, because if you had that insulin resistance that you were giving yourself with all those fatty acids and you were consuming carbohydrates, then you would have very slow disposal of those dietary carbohydrates, but you're not consuming them. So what you end up having is just a slow disposal of mostly liver exported glucose.
Okay.
And yes, that is a pretty common thing to happen. And I think that's very telling.
Yeah. Because a few people have contacted us now that like they were on keto for a really long time and their blood glucose, their fasted glucose was rising. And then when they added back in carbohydrates and slightly reduced their fat consumption, their fasting glucose dropped. Because like you said, now they're reintroducing that dietary glucose. But I just thought that was an interesting trend, but your explanation makes sense. But Okay, so I want to wrap up with like just I think that if someone is really persistent in staying in ketosis, like that's totally fine. My advice would be prioritize saturated fats and then just try to cycle out of ketosis every once in a while. Like make sure that you are introducing carbs at some point. Um, any other final tips Kyle has or any other discussion points?
I always say the same thing, which is like, because obviously there's a lot of people that just want to, like, they're in like a combative or defensive mode about it, and not even to just project that onto people, but like people have their belief, they're into it.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's making them feel good now, whatever. I would just say, like, just pay attention. Like if you start to have a negative symptom that you notice or something pop up in your blood work, like fasting glucose, don't, I mean, it's your choice, but like that is information, and it may be like hurtful, and it may cause people to have like, because they believe in something, and now they're having this contradictory information, and a lot of people then do it harder, right? It's like, oh, well, are you consuming too much protein? You get on these, and it just becomes like a mental illness factory where these people encourage, it's like anorexic girl Tumblr, where there's like, oh, I ate like I ate a half a cup of popcorn today, and they're like, did you throw it up? Like, and again, not that these obviously these people aren't, and not even that that's, I mean, I guess it's funny, but it's also not funny. But these people spur themselves on because they get in these communities that are not open to the idea that their way of eating is not perfect or the best way. So I just like, just pay attention. And if that bad stuff never happens, then I don't know. I guess I'm wrong, and that's like good for you.
Well, and I think also pay attention to like other lifestyle factors. If you're in a really stressful state in your life, like if you're facing a lot of stress in other unavoidable life factors, then just like maybe accept that forcing ketosis and fasting will just add more stress, and it may just not be the right time to do that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely orthorexic when I was going through those like extreme diets, like raw vegan and stuff like that, and I could not see outside of that dietary paradigm that anything would be more important for my health.
Yeah.
But I know like a million times more about nutrition and diets and stuff now than I did then.
Yeah.
And I see any particular diet as much less important than I did then. So just think about that. Like,
yeah, there's more to life than just the food that you consume too.
yeah, like you're not going to, I mean, if you have a pathological condition and you get put on any kind of like healthy diet, you will solve a lot of your problems. But if you have like all kinds of like you're not going to like, solve your life's problems by like cutting out a macronutrient or something. Like it's not, like people think of it as this magical thing, and it's really marketed that way. And that's the part that actually like gets me angry and makes me like say mean things to people online, because I think people are being taken advantage of because people are looking for, whether they want like a quick fix or something, people are always looking for like different answers. And apparently there's plenty of people that are willing to, tell them that this is the answer to their problems. And I just don't agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Kyle, where can people find you?
Nutrichronology, which is the first 8 letters of nutrition, and NUTRICRINOLOGY at YouTube.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then I'm sure I'll have to get you back on because I know that there will be some comments on this video. So we'll definitely get Kyle back on. So if you guys have any pressing questions, make sure you put it in the comments below. But appreciate your time, and thank you for coming on the channel again.
Yeah, it was fun.